I'm Tim, welcome to Watch One, and thanks for logging on. Well, I'm back with a couple of watches from our inventory after taking a little vacation for a few days. So, to reintroduce Rolex, and for that matter, myself to the channel, I wanted to focus on more of a guide to buying watches than a specific showcase of any individual watch. Now, I find that Rolex is sort of a bellwether for the industry and a standard of reference for watch consumers, and perhaps no manufacturer has seen more changes in the size and shape of its cases and bracelets than Rolex over the past 30 years. And there are a lot of references like the Deep Sea, like the Yacht-Master 2, like the Sky Dweller, that are bigger and shaped differently than better known classical Rolex references. And the number one question people ask when buying a watch over the internet is, how does it fit? And more precisely, what is the lug-to-lug measurement? Now, lug-to-lug measurement, for those of you who are out there in cyberspace, you know that that means essentially the true size of the watch. Its span from one extremity of the case to the other. And that's the biggest measure of how a watch is going to fit. More than mass, more than thickness, more than perhaps the nominal diameter of the watch. For instance, in the case of this Deep Sea, it's 44 millimeters. But I can tell you, having measured it, the lug-to-lug measurement is 53 millimeters. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to move that little Pepsi, this Sky Dweller, and our Yacht-Master 2 out of the frame for the time being. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the fit of the Deep Sea, because in a lot of ways, the Sea Dweller family was the first of the Rolex model lines to wreak havoc on our notion of how a modern Rolex fits. From the early 80s, when the solid end links debuted, to the 2008 launch of the Deep Sea, the Sea Dweller has been a little bit of a pioneer in the changing profile of Rolex on the wrist. Now you can see on my wrist, 6 1/3 inches, 16 centimeters in circumference. The Deep Sea wears with a lot of presence. This is the key number to remember, 53 millimeters lug-to-lug. So while it is a 44, it's a big 44, and it's worth mentioning that it's the biggest 44 that Rolex offers. Another key distinction that I want to make regarding Rolex bracelets, since I mentioned the advent of solid end links first on the Sea Dweller family, I want to emphasize that they add approximately 1.5 to 2 millimeters per side when you have solid end links, that is, this center section of the bracelet when it's solid, and it bends outward to meet the bracelet rather than being a pivoting portion in its own right. It adds a virtual 3 to 4 millimeters to the total span of the watch across the wrist. That's what you need to know with the Deep Sea, which is the biggest both in shape and size as well as lug-to-lug measurement in the current Rolex catalog. Now, to emphasize the difference that shape can make on a watch, I want to bring in another 44 millimeter Rolex. In this case, the most complicated modern Rolex, the Yacht-Master 2. Now, when the Yacht-Master 2 launched, it was considered to be a bit of a monster, somewhat ahead of the Deep Sea in the launch schedule. It was also a monstrous complication. Now, I do have a video demonstrating how to set the regatta timer, so I'm going to focus on fit here. Already you can see, although a monster, it's not quite the monster that the Deep Sea is. You can see even with the solid end links, 51 millimeters from lug-to-lug, so you add your virtual 3 or 4 with the solid end links, you can see that it wears lower on the wrist. It wears a little bit narrower from lug-to-lug, and on my wrist, 6 1/3 inches, that's 16 centimeters, is a better match for the size of this watch. So both 44, but the Yacht-Master is easier to wear because it is a pared down case. It has about 3 millimeters less span across the wrist than the otherwise identically sized Deep Sea. That's why the nominal case measurement in millimeters should be one of many factors that you take into consideration. Now, in 2011, we saw something completely new. The 6-digit reference, sort of revival Steve McQueen Explorer 2. Now, I know Steve McQueen never wore this watch, or he never wore one that looks like it in the 1655 reference. That doesn't matter, because Bart Simpson never wore a Rolex either, and he's got one named after him. A whole series, in fact. And the bottom line is that this watch, 42 millimeters, wears more like the Yacht-Master 2 than it does the Deep Sea. And for that matter, it also wears broader, flatter, and a little bit more massive than even the Sky Dweller. And the key thing to remember is, well, it's a 42 millimeters, it's the same 51 millimeters lug-to-lug as the Yacht-Master. So though smaller nominally, 42, it's just as broad from lug-to-lug, and with the solid end links, you get that little bit of extra flair. My wrist is 16 centimeters, but eyes closed, this feels exactly the same as the Yachtmaster 2, and that's the Explorer 2 current reference 216570 in stainless steel. Now, moving on, I want to talk a little bit about one of the other big boys introduced in the late 2000s, the bigger, bolder Datejust 2. Now, this one is rated at 41 millimeters. That's the minimal space, again, from one round portion to another round portion of the case, not counting the crown, not counting the lugs. It's not a diagonal measurement. And we can see on my wrist, this one wears not a little bit smaller than the 42 Explorer 2, but a lot smaller than the 42 millimeter Explorer 2. Now, although it has the same 51 millimeter lug-to-lug measurement, it's much more pared down, far less massive. And I can tell you that although Rolex will tell you it's 1 millimeter's worth of difference, the feeling on the wrist, both in terms of heft and in terms of span side to side, is very distinct. So while the distance between extremities may be exactly the same at 51 millimeters, there's a world of difference between this, the Explorer 2, and the Yachtmaster 2. So the Datejust 2, while bigger and bolder than a Datejust, is a step down in wrist real estate. I would be remiss if I did not mention the original 40 millimeter Yachtmaster in the same video as the Yachtmaster 2. Now, this one is a very traditional two-tone 40 millimeter Yachtmaster 2. This is the way Rolex used to be. This is the closest thing to a classical pared down pre-super case 40 millimeter Rolex. Now, while it does have the solid end links, all Yachtmasters have had those. The 40 millimeters in this case is a total distinction from the others. So remember how the 44 millimeter Yachtmaster wore 51 millimeters? Well, the 40 millimeter original Yachtmaster, as opposed to the Yachtmaster 2, this wears 48 millimeters from lug to lug. So 48 millimeters from lug to lug, but considerably slimmer, lighter on the wrist. It's a completely different sensation. The way you feel it is almost a dress watch on the wrist in comparison to the latter Yachtmaster 2. And for that matter, although it's only 1 millimeter smaller than even the Datejust 2, it wears 3 millimeters smaller across the wrist, and in terms of mass, a big difference. Now I want to wind up by looking at a current generation 6-digit Daytona case. Now this one definitely has the big bling going on. Full gold. This is the 116528 18 karat yellow gold case and bracelet. So the mass of this one is its defining feature, but being a very pared down form compared to the modern supercase Submariners and GMT Master 2s, by no means does this one feel overwhelming in spite of its sheer heft. While one of the heavier Rolex watches you can buy, it's worth mentioning that this particular watch, 40 millimeters in diameter, is only 47 millimeters lug to lug, so even a little bit more pared down than the original 5-digit Yachtmaster we just looked at. The defining features of this watch are really how slim it is, how fine it is, how low it sits on the wrist, and also how pared down it is at the edges of your wrist. Now, the Daytona's had solid end links since 1999, but even with that extra 3 to 4 millimeters of span projecting outward from the lugs, you don't get the sense that this one's going to be any trouble on a wrist, even as small as 6 inches or 15 centimeters. If you're okay wearing the mass of a full gold watch, and let's face it, that's a nice problem to have, you're going to have no issues with the fit of any contemporary Rolex Daytona, even in precious metal. I'm Tim, and this is WatchYouWant.com.